I'm here early for a sound test. It's the old minute early sound test. Do, do, do. Testing the sound. Oh, my MacBook is auto adjusting the sound. That's interesting. About a minute to go. Do 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 do. Hey, sick. There's someone here. Yes, Kyle. Kyle, can you hear me? Okay, Biggers. However you want it. Yeah, Hannah's here. Oh, Connor's here too. How's the sound, guys? You bet. Oh, great. Biggers got it. Sweet. I wonder if I can take a. Oh, there we go. Great. Great sound. Please don't crisp. Love it. Great. Okay, so we're going to start in about a minute. I hope you guys are excited. You know, this is, I honestly, I think it would be nicer to do like a Google Hangout. Maybe I'll just keep this one short. We'll do this one this style, but what I really like about Cool School is talking to people. So in this one, I can just lay out what I'm going to do. All right, let's start. So, the whole reason for doing this for me, I was going to do a Cool School event, and it was suggested to do it online. But I was reading a bunch of resources for World War II to teach it again this summer, and there's one. It's a documentary called "The Sorrow and the Pity," and I was really blown away by it. I was like, it is a powerful documentary about France after World War II. But it's really hard to get or enjoy without context. And the only reason I know the context is from years after year of teaching it. And I was like, oh, I really want to do a Cool School around giving you the context you need to watch The Sorrow and the Pity. But I was also like, The Sorrow and the Pity is not for everyone. It's a pretty heavy movie. So I have a little list of resources that I was like, oh, yeah. Some I think are, to me, on humanity's list of everyone has to read this. Like Elia Wiesel's Night. Anyone read Night? Have you guys read Night? Because I highly recommend it. And I was like, I want to do a Cool School just giving World War II context around these things. That's even better because everyone's like, yeah, read it. I did my thesis on it. What are you going to talk about? So great. Glad you haven't read it. I hope. So here are the books and movies. There's only about 6 of them that I wanted to do lessons giving context for. So they are Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. That's the Anne Frank book, which I had never read till last year. It was my first year reading it. Yeah, great read. And then Night by Wiesel. Winter in Wartime is a book I just read. And The Hiding Place was a book I had read before. The Sorrow and the Pity, the movie. Sarah's Key. This is a book I'm pretty critical of. It's really interesting. Students love it, but I'm like, guys, but it got a lot of them into the history of World War II France. Okay, so let's talk about these sources. There's 3 big strands to World War II survivors I wanted to talk about. So I'll give the background to World War II, but right now, all you need to know is it's Germany, controlled by the Nazi government, the National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazi government. They're in control and they're taking over Europe. Literally, they're expanding. They've taken Poland, they've taken the Netherlands, they've taken France. Germany is kicking ass and taking over Europe. And we have never experienced this in Canada, and the US has never experienced it. So it makes World War II literature really interesting for Canadians and Americans trying to relate to, because a huge theme for all these European countries, which we do not get and we don't talk about, you know, literally our narrative on World War II is Star Wars. It's this idea of like good versus evil, combat in the sky, and we won. And that's how America remembers the war in a lot of its movies. But in Europe, the Nazi, so this is Germany, and they took over the surrounding countries. Early in the war, Nazi Germany was unbeatable. They were just kicking ass. It really looked like they were going to win the whole thing and just keep all of that land as part of Germany. But it ended up being temporary. When Nazi Germany lost, they were shattered. They got cut in half. Germany got cut in half. That's kind of the post-war story. But the big theme was who collaborated with the Nazis and who resisted the Nazis. Because your country, for a series of 4 years for some countries, or 3 years, was taken over by Nazi Germany. And how they would do that was they would, it's not like Hitler would roll into your parliament and go, oh, I sit in the chair and I make the decisions here. You would basically still function as France or still function as the Netherlands. But the government in charge would be obviously an ally of the Nazis. So for instance, in France's example, Nazi Germany early in the war invaded France. France tried to hold them. The Nazis went around and they were just going to roll into Paris and start bombing it. And the French government said, okay, let's negotiate, like not a surrender, but let's just negotiate a treaty so we won't attack you and you don't attack us. It's basically a surrender. So the government that did that, they called the Vichy government. That government, it's a French government, but it is an ally of the Nazis because they were like, no more war. So obviously anyone in that government is going to be like, we're not having it. We don't have any plans to invade Nazi Germany. Then after the war, there's a really tense climate, and there's a lot of finger pointing about who was resisting, because you didn't know that the Nazis were going to lose. So who was resisting during this whole time, and what son of a bitch was collaborating? Like who was giving names of anyone resisting? Who was selling out? So it's a very complex and very, I mean, for us, it's so simple. It's like, yeah, don't collaborate. Should all resisted. They were Nazis, because we have such a, good, evil understanding of it. And so too, Europe a lot. No one is like pro-Nazi now. I mean, there is anyway a rightist movement, but it's not majority. But the fact is, this feeling of your heroes, some of your heroes were part of that government. Some of old war heroes and older people in government who were just trying to avoid war. Are they now treasonous criminals? It's a really tricky issue that Canadians and Americans never think about. And some of this literature just grabs right hold of that and is like, that's what we're doing. So for this lesson, I'm going to walk through the literature that I recommend, and I'm going to walk through the 3 categories. And then I'll end by giving a very subtle, not subtle, but light, superficial history of World War II. And then we can do, in subsequent talks, better, deeper dives to really set up the context. And you don't have to read any of these books. I'm going to kind of spoil some of them, because in my opinion, when a book is a real classic, it can't be spoiled. Because you could know the beginning, middle, and end, and because it's such a powerful book, what's missing, even if you hear it summarized, is like your relationship with the book. Anne Frank is a great example of that. Okay, so let me go through that. That hits on two of the major themes of World War II for this survivor literature: resistance and collaboration. Who was fighting back and who was fighting with Nazi Germany. And as you can imagine, after the war, well, everyone just says that we're resisting. Like, so many people are like, "Oh yeah, I was just about to get them," and that's what the sorrow and the pity is about. Because after World War II, France wants to remember that they resisted Nazi Germany, and so they kind of reclaim their history by distancing themselves from that Vichy government. And then this guy produced a documentary interviewing people that was just so savage they didn't play it on TV. There was like, let's not show that now, and they delayed it, and eventually they showed it in France. But it's like, you know, oh, you all thought you were resistors? It takes a real pot shot at that mythology. But at the same time, you can understand why a government that had just collaborated with Nazi Germany was eager to create some healing and move on by, celebrating resistance and letting people feel like they all resisted. Okay, so that's resistance and collaboration. And the other major theme is the Holocaust of survivor writing. So the Holocaust was the planned killing of Jews. But when you really take a look at it, there's more people than Jews involved in the prisons and the murdering. And we'll look at that a little more detail in this lesson. Okay, let me walk through what each thing is about, kind of like pitching it to pump you up. Maybe you want to check out The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Okay, so this story is Anne Frank is a German, and when the Nazis come into power, they start persecuting Jews, putting them in prisons, and eventually exterminating them. Like, their plan was, Jews are a race that is poisoning the bloodline. It does everyone a favor to exterminate them. It's not an exaggeration. It's literally a planned extermination was the Holocaust. And it took place there's some in Germany, but they took over Poland and they start to build, they had prison camps all over Germany and in Poland. Everywhere they conquered, they needed prison camps for anyone who resisted. And they called those concentration camps. A concentration camp is literally where you concentrate people. Concentration camps are temporary prisons. It's when you don't really have the laws to put people in prison, but you're at war or there's some emergency. So you're like, we'll just round up all these people and concentrate them in one area to deal with later. So it's kind of like people are in prison forever without really getting a trial. And the Nazis used these to put political enemies in and put people to work. And then they opened extermination camps, which is almost like the next level of what a concentration camp would be, because not everyone can work and people are getting sick. So they started to sort people, Jews, to be like, if you can work, you can go to this camp and work. But if you're too sick, they're putting people on trains off to extermination camps where the sole purpose of the camp was to kill Jews. When Anne Frank's family is in Germany, none of that is happening. It's a year away from that really starting, but they're persecuting Jews. They create new laws in Germany about jobs that Jews can have. So, and there's this awful night, the Kristallnacht, we'll talk about later, but it's the famous German riot against Jews. I also want to say, and we will talk about this, the Nazis did not invent hating Jews. It's a very tragic and long history in Europe. And if you've ever wondered about the history of anti-Semitism, we'll touch on that too. Hitler doesn't invent it. He certainly promotes it and kind of capitalizes on some feeling about it. But the Nazis did not invent hating Jews. So Anne Frank's family leaves Germany and they go to the Netherlands, which is a country just to the north, neighboring Germany. Well, when Germany expands, they take over the Netherlands. And as Germany expands, they start saying those to those countries like France that they took over, like the Netherlands, round up your Jews because we have a place to send them. So when they first took over, this was never fully part of the plan. But as the war goes on, they're like, this is part of the plan, round up the Jews. And so that's a huge issue of like, and this is part of France's tragedy as well. Again, just if I can step away from Anne Frank's story, in France, the French police were like, okay, I guess we round up the Jews in Paris. And they did it for the Nazis. There is a story about that later on. But anyway, Anne Frank's family goes to the Netherlands, and then the Nazis take over, and they're like, oh, fuck. What do? Do you try to escape or do you hide? So her family has some money and they decide to hide in like an office, like the back of an office. It's like a 2-floor space that they hide the door behind a bookshelf, and a few people try to stay there. This has happened all over the Netherlands, people just hiding and trying to stay and wait out the war. We'll just wait it out. Can't go on forever. And Anne Frank's story is the diary of her just living there. That's it. To kind of spoil it, it's way less the story of Nazis and way more just a young teen girl's diary of like coming of age. It's like you're just like listening to a teen. You do get glimpses. Obviously, she's living in this self captivity. You know, she's a prisoner, but as the Germans kind of take over, you're like, wow, it's really serious, and they need outside help to get food. So you've got Dutch people who risk their lives to get them food, and that is always kind of going on in the background. But the real story is Anne. And this is the really beautiful part, as toward the end of the war, the Dutch government, so the Dutch government in the Netherlands, they're working with the Nazis, they're collaborating. But the Dutch government that was like, we never accepted the Nazis, they've gone to the UK. Same with the French government. So the French government, well, it's a tough position to just be on radio in the UK, but they're like, we're not giving up. And the Dutch government in the UK would broadcast, and they said, they're like, hey, anyone writing anything down, let me tell you this, the Nazis are going to lose this war. They're already losing. And we want you to keep whatever you're writing down, because we're going to collect it all after the war. And we're going to make books about the struggle the Dutch people went through when the Nazis fucking took over for a bit. And he didn't swear on the radio, but Anne Frank heard this radio broadcast, and she was like, damn, I'm going to do that with my diary. So what I found out about Anne Frank's diary, and I love, is she saw herself as a writer. And she took her diary and she was like, oh, and take my favorite parts here, kind of pump them up a little. And she was writing and refining the story, the book that she wanted to share about her experiences. The tragedy is she did not make it through the war. Anne Frank died. The family was caught, sent to a concentration camp. We don't know directly how, but we assume from the diseases in this concentration camp, right very close to the end of the war. Her father survived and later collected her story and had it published. So when you read the diary of Anne Frank, you're reading what she wanted, but also the dad's voice his voice isn't directly in there, but he edited it and he put in some more controversial stuff that maybe she would not have wanted in, about like she shit talks her mom for not quite a bit, but there's one part where you're like, oh, she does not connect with her mom. I loved it because I was like, this is honest and it's so teen. And to me, like a big chunk of the book was there's a boy staying in the place with them. And when he's first there, it's like, oh, whatever. But then she has a coming of age. Like she starts menstruating for the first time in captivity, and she has a cool reaction to it. I really love her take on it. But then she's like, oh, this boy, his eyes are so, oh my God, this boy. And so it's kind of a privilege to hear this diary of this teen's story. And she's kind of writing about the day, and then all of a sudden the entry stops. It just stops. There's no Spielberg Hollywood moment. There's no girl with the red jacket walking through the black and white crowd like Schindler's List. It's just, it's over. And so for me, you got to read Diary of Anne Frank. And I listen to it a lot with Helena Bonham Carter, just doing the audiobook. But there's no other way to meet Anne. You'll connect to the parts that you connect to as she goes on about her life, and you'll meet Anne. And then it's just over. And so, yeah, it's the most famous book for putting a human face on the Holocaust. The next book is Night. Now, this is a guy, Wiesel. He lives in Romania, so the Nazis keep expanding as far as Romania. And by this time they get to him, they're like a refined machine. They roll into the town and they're like, where are the Jews? We're shipping them this way, separating them. We need labor because we're losing this war. And anyone not fit to work, we're just sending to be cremated right away. So Wiesel's story is like right into hell. It is, to me, when I make my list of like, mandatory reading for humanity, Night is the only book that's consistently there. You get a deep dive looking into the hellish prison system of Nazi Germany, and it is not an easy read. And that's what I value about it, because now I watch any Holocaust movie, and always in a Holocaust movie, they're trying to spin it. They're always trying to put a spin of like a bright day, or like the sunshine at the end, or some nice character on the inside, or some Nazi who gets it. Man, when you read actual Holocaust literature from survivors, like I've read Night and Primo Levi, those who are in the prison system, the point is there's no sunshine. And to me, to even like be creative and be like, maybe there was a cute dog that cheered them up now and again, it is like such a slap in the face. So I'm like, read Night, because it is the book to me to learn about the Holocaust. Okay, next books. When I was in Amsterdam last summer, I asked them, what do they read in schools? Because you could probably appreciate, obviously they're like, oh, the Diary of Anne Frank. But if you live in Amsterdam, that's the story of a German girl who was persecuted because the Nazis were fucking crazy. It's like if in Canadian schools we're like, oh yeah, we read this book of this American who had to flee to Canada because Americans are nuts. So obviously everyone in the Netherlands is like, yeah, Diary of Anne Frank, great. Visit her house as a museum. But for the Dutch, they have another book that most teens read, and it is called Winter in Wartime. It's about a 16-year-old or 15-year-old kid growing up in the Netherlands when the Nazis are in charge. And I thought it was excellent. But here's the thing, it is not a true story. It's written by a guy who lived through it. And I just really like his agenda. He basically set out to write the book that kids should read in school to learn about living under Nazi Germany. So you lose the truth of it, but you get more Hollywood moments. But you at least get those Hollywood moments from someone who lived through it. So that's a book I kind of don't want to spoil, because it's not actually someone's life story. He sets it up as like there's mystery going on. But I thought it was a very short, all these books are short, by the way, which I like. Sorry. You guys are right away like, oh, a short book? I only read, anyway, sorry. I apologize multiple times. Yeah, Winter in Wartime, great book about resistance. The next one's The Hiding Place. This is a woman's true story, an older woman who helps hide Jews in the Netherlands with the Nazis there. And toward the end of the book, she's caught for helping, and they send her, she's like 50, 60 years old. They send her to a concentration camp to be processed for, it's just nuts. Like, it's like, that to me was a good look at like, this system is way off the rails of anything. Oh my God. She certainly goes through a lot. And yeah, anyway, she really holds on to her Christianity. And I was like, don't, this is too messed up, but obviously do, because you have to keep your sanity somehow. The next one is, I have here is The Sorrow and the Pity. It's the ultimate documentary about collaboration. The Nazis take over France. Everyone says they were part of the resistance. This doc explores really complicated, weird ways in which the French assisted the Nazis. And then I've got one called Sarah's Key. This is the last one I'll talk about. That's a really interesting book because it's made up, but it really draws attention to a part of history not a lot of people were talking about, which is the moment when the French police work for the Nazis and round up Jews. So again, to recap, when Nazi Germany takes over other countries, your government changes to kind of be their ally. If you don't change, you're dead, or you flee to the UK. So they changed, and they were struggling to be like, we're still French, we're not Nazis, but then push came to shove, and the Nazis were like, okay, round up the Jews in Paris. And the French police, not the Nazi police, the French police complied. And they were knocking on doors, and they had their lists, and they went around and they rounded up Jews, and they brought them to one central location, which was a velodrome, like where they do bike races. It's just a big arena at that point. No one's racing bikes. And so they call it the Vel d'Hiv Roundup, the Winter Dome Roundup, or they just call it La Rafle, the Roundup. Right after the war, the French were not ready to talk about it, and only now are books and things talking about it. And to Paris's credit, to France's credit, they do have multiple memorials now around the city remembering what happened. But I'm conflicted about this book because the author makes up a story within the roundup of a Jewish family, and I'm like, man, the reality's so sad. It frustrates me when someone's like, oh, wouldn't it be more sad if? So it's not based on a true story. She didn't live through it, but my high school students are like, it really made me think about the Vel d'Hiv Roundup. So it has that going for it. And it was kind of a popular book, but I have an issue with a lot of historical fiction that is just like looking for its Hollywood moment. And Sarah's Key has such a Hollywood moment that I'm like, yeah. Okay, what are we at? 28 minutes. Great. That leaves us a quick 7 minutes to just talk about World War II history. And great. That's all I need anyway. Okay, if you want to understand World War II, you got to know, when we look back, it's not World War I and World War II are one war, is what I'm trying to say. It's one war with a pause in between. Okay, so to understand World War II, you really have to understand what happens after World War I. So in another lesson, I can get into World War I, but right now we'll just talk afterward. After World War I, all of the world powers are devastated. They did not expect the war to kill so many millions of lives. World War II was so many times worse as well. But at the time, they were like, World War I, nothing worse than that will ever happen. That was awful. And Germany lost that war. And all of the world powers were like, it was Germany's fault. So there's going to be a treaty to end the war. But part of that treaty is Germany is going to admit that they're the prime fuck-ups who caused this war, and they're going to pay money to help rebuild our countries. Even though they're also devastated, they're going to pay because it was their fault. It was called the War Guilt Clause. That's the end of World War I, which was a devastating war. The next thing that happens is, so that's like the year 1918. There are not too many years, but I would say knowing World War I is 1914 to 1918. I'll keep repeating it as I do these lessons. And knowing that World War II is like 1939 to 1945 are nice benchmarks. When you read a book, it's always fun to go, oh, that was written before World War II. I really enjoy that, putting it in context. Okay, so Germany is so punished. And then you have in 1929, the stock market collapses. Everyone around the world is suffering. Germany, you know, the Great Depression, that was caught. Any image of the Great Depression, poor farmers, triple it, times it by 10. That's Germany's situation. They were really hit hard. And so out of this chaos, out of an economic decline, comes a guy who says, look, our democracy is not working. We need strong leadership, and we're the underdog, like the world, for taking everything from us. Obviously, this is Hitler. Hitler was a fascist leader. Fascism means use the military structure to solve it. Like, what is the military value? Obedience, discipline, war, but discipline and obedience and like one leader at the top. That's fascism in a nutshell. It's like, we're having problems. The fascist solution is, let's get a military command structure. Things will be way more efficient, and that's how we're going to fix the crisis. So World War I directly causes World War II. Directly. You don't have Hitler unless you have the big punishment that Germany gets after World War I. So Germany then, led by Hitler, has this huge revitalizing, trend, like this huge upswing of, this is the guy and he can do it. So actually, at first, Germany after World War I was forced to be a democracy, and Hitler is elected. He becomes the elected leader. But then after some stuff we can talk about later, he becomes like emergency powers. Something has happened. I need powers to lock people up if need be. And once he gets those emergency powers, it's over. Germany starts to build up their military, which they weren't allowed to do, to restore their rightful place. And Hitler starts to command to invade other countries. Great. Great. And it's not great. I mean, it was great I guess it's a matter of perspective. It wasn't great. And then as they're putting people in prisons, the next thing on his agenda is, conquering Europe, conquering Russia, which he didn't get to do. He failed. And also eradicating the Jews from Europe. So in the Holocaust, if we want to talk more about, I can canvas you guys for like what people want to learn more about. But if you want to learn more about the Holocaust, there's a couple trends there that deliberately contribute to it. I might as well get into it a little bit as we'll wrap up in a few minutes. So the Holocaust is the mass murdering of Jews, the extermination of Jews. And it kind of feels always like Hitler just kind of came up with it. But to take a look at anti-Semitism in Europe, you've got to really realize that a pogrom, like the word pogrom, P-O-R-G-R-O-M, no, P-O-G-R-O-M, pogrom. It's a specific riot against Jewish people. And there's a word for it. Like, that's how common they were in Europe. This goes back even as far as the Crusades, like the 1200s, where Jewish women, Jewish men, Jewish children, Jewish businesses would be targeted, destroyed, smashed, and Jews would be beat up and killed. It's like, how could that ever have been such a regular occurrence that it has its own word? I just watched the HBO series Watchmen. It was not great in the end, but it opens with the Tulsa race riot, which not a lot of people knew about. It's a successful area of Tulsa where Black people lived and owned businesses, was attacked by white people, burned down, businesses destroyed, women raped, men killed. That is a race riot. That's like targeting people who based on race, and destroying their livelihood and them. And it's happened throughout history. So Jews had, it happens when you get like segregation. Jews were often forced to live. So Jews have their own language and their own religion. And so they would be singled out, and instead of any integration, they'd be forced to live in a ghetto or in a certain area and be like, that is where the Jews live. And basically, when tensions would arise unrelated to Jews, people would blame Jews for their failings, crop failings, and then say we have to attack the Jews. It's their fault, especially if they seem to be doing all right. I mean, in a way, I'm trying to explain the logic behind all race riots, which doesn't ever seem logical from the outset. I think you really have to connect to a certain kind of anger and ignorance to understand. I am trying to think what the equivalent, an equivalent I thought of is in Canada, we had a shooting at a mosque. And I don't think Canada is on the verge of having a race riot against Muslims, but the anniversary of that mosque shooting was back in January, and I don't remember a lot being done. So for me, all cultures are drawing these lines about like who counts as in and who counts as out. And they have you either like celebrate or make a moment of a tragedy to show that we're stronger, or you kind of go like that's someone else's business. So I think even in our lightweight way, we do carry on this kind of cultural distancing, which then can lead to dehumanization and race riots in its worst incarnation. So the trend of Jews living in a certain area of town was known kind of throughout Europe, and race riots, especially in what the area they called the Pale, which is like the edge of Russia, were very common. So when Hitler was blaming Jews for what had happened, it was the Jews who sold out Germany in World War One. That was like a kind of a familiar narrative, in the way that you could say like, oh, all Muslims trying to get in the country are planning terrorism. It's like any rational person is like, that's ridiculous. But we also live in a time where you see that message resonate and make people double think certain things. So it was not an invention of Hitler, although he was, he grew up in Austria. He wasn't even German. That's so wild itself, where he's like always about the German people. But he grew up in Austria, and at the time there was a leader in Austria who was really into like, the Jews have done everything the Jews do is negative. It was kind of the political leadership of the area that Hitler grew up in, and he kind of really soaked that in and took it to the next level, and also found it resonated, because when people are suffering, they look quickly for whose fault it might be. So the Jews have historically been a scapegoat, and Hitler kind of he rode that train, but he also believed in that train. Because another strand going on that we don't often talk about is science. I keep saying we're going to end here, but we're going to end on this note. I just want to talk about science contribution to the Holocaust, because in the 1700s and 1800s, everyone was like, oh, the Enlightenment, oh, science, oh, we love it. Oh, we're discovering so many new things. Oh, I love it. Science can solve everything. And one thing science does really well on its way to solutions is categorize. This is here and this is here, and that really helps make decisions. And it's all true. Like a bird can't survive underwater and a fish doesn't fly in the air. Those are different categories. Well, they took the rigid categories and they applied them scientifically. This was science in the 1800s, the late 1800s. They applied them to people, and they argued that people were different races, basically like different species. And this informed, if I am biologically better at physical labor and my brain can never grow to have decision-making ideas, isn't it actually nicer to me to make me work in a field. So the science of the time, rigidly showing that people were different, was justifying slavery, which contributed to the forced migration of black people to America to work as slaves. And it was like, oh yes, this all makes sense. By the 1900s, some of that is fizzling out, but some of that's held strong. So when Hitler is thinking about Germany, this is like the last gasp of this thinking. He's like, it's very rigid. If Jews breed with pure Germans, it ruins the bloodline. It'll turn us into weaklings. They need to be eliminated. So the role of science in thinking in that way, I don't think can be understated. Because after the Holocaust, when we started to realize, when you put two and two together, it's like, yeah, he just took to the nth degree what everyone had kind of been arguing. We were like, oh, we don't like that. I actually don't think it makes sense to divide people up in that way. And any way you can divide people up seems to be really influenced by the time that you live in. So science took a real kick in the crotch after World War II, because it was a huge part of the justification that made nodding sense to most people. They're just like, yes, they are different, and we need to remove them like a tumor, like as long as they don't breed. And so Hitler applied that to homosexuals. So they persecuted homosexuals, put them in prison, make sure they can't breed, kill them, put them to work, kill them if necessary. They were also like Polish people. They would do this to Slavic or Polish people, where they were like, the Germans are one race and the Poles are a different race. So this is kind of where it's like they're kind of making it up as they go, but also riding on what people thought in the time. And then by the time you get to Elie Wiesel's, and sometimes the Germans, they use the letter W as a V. So that's why I say Wiesel, but it looks like Wiesel. I'd love to see him say his own name, but I do believe it's Wiesel. By the time you get to Knight, it's like full on, these people are not human. And then he's on his hellish journey. Okay, well, that's an introduction to those survivor books. I'd like to do this again, and for sure, I'd like to do a Google chat instead of a YouTube live, because I much prefer conversation and you guys having questions. If you have any questions, my knowledge is limited, but words like colonialism or existentialism, the Cool School started where I was kind of just trying to demystify big words. If you have real interests, you want to know more World War I or World War II, I'd be more than happy to chat with you about it. Because I do think the spirit of this age right now is not in doing YouTube lives talking at someone, but in having conversations. I think that's what we're all craving, or will be craving. So hit me up for any history questions that you have. And if I don't know the answer, I'm excited to read up about it. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Click subscribe, share, click on my sponsors. So one sponsor is click on and double download definitely download